We have with us Professor Ralph Hood, Jr., who will present William James and Psychology's non-replication crisis, controversy in the psychology of religion, discussing that James's suggestions for an alternative paradigm can provide a conversation between advocates of naturalistic and theistic psychology. Professor Hood Jr. is a faculty member of the psychology department at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He is a former editor of the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion and former co-editor of the Archive for the Psychology of Religion and the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion. Without further ado, we will begin the presentation.
At this conference, the title of my talk is William James and the Non-Replication Crisis in Psychology, Conjectures and Controversy in the Psychology of Religion. Since this paper is currently in press, I'd be happy to give a copy of the full paper to anyone who can request it via email. So let me begin now with this very abbreviated version. Soon it will be 2 decades since one of the most distinguished scholars in the psychology of religion asked the rhetorical question, is it time to start over? The question was raised in the context of the presupposition of a field in crisis. Today, this crisis might seem to pale under the penumbra of the COVID-19 virus. Still, there are good reasons to consider starting over in the field of psychology of religion, particularly in its American incarnation. This is not the first time this suggestion has been made. My exemplar for this will be to appeal to the insights of William James in order to continue the conversation he started. Daniel Robinson was asked to inaugurate the William James Award for Division I, General Psychology of the American Psychological Association. His invited address was titled The Tradition of William James. 7 years later, at the 100th anniversary of the APA convention, Daniel Robinson was asked to give the William James Centennial Address. This time his address was titled The Case for a Uniquely American Tradition in Psychology. He asserted that the current authoritative views of psychology are entirely at odds with William James, and that incompatibility separates contemporary psychology from what is arguably the entire point of the discipline, namely a fuller understanding of the function of mind in a shifting world of matter. William James would also unlikely qualify for the award given his name. The lack of a Jamesian legacy in the psychology of religion is foundational to the lack of his legacy in contemporary psychology in general. Robinson has high praise for William James, calling his Principles of Psychology the gold standard of text in general psychology by America's greatest philosopher. It might seem absurd to claim a text written over a quarter of a century since its centennial edition is worth other than a historical read. However, Robinson argues that despite strident critiques, contemporary psychology remains committed to experimental procedures modeled after the natural sciences, based largely upon aggregated data, statistically treated as replicable. This was precisely the model of psychological science James abandoned. Robinson's philosophical critique of psychological theories is that most are metaphysical translations of the experimental setting. The goal of this constrained view of psychological science is to peel away the sui generis aspects of persons in favor of identifiable processes in which what is most psychological is discarded in the error terms in quantitative analysis. It has been 50 years since Dede published his review of the psychology of religion in the then only Handbook of Social Psychology to have a chapter on religion. Dede's provided 4 possible options, selected not only for their methodological but their ontological implications. His options do not directly address issues of psychological science or epistemological issues such as falsifiability. However, they raise, if only implicitly, ontological issues other than naturalism. Among psychologists of religion committed to psychological science, this is indeed rare. Two of Didi's options support methods that allow the psychology of religion to integrate with mainstream psychological science and avoid direct engagement with ontological terms. Didi's first option is the claim that the only variables operating in religion are the same that operate in mainstream psychology. Here is religiousness, not religion. The psychology of religion need have no unique methodologies, as its subject matter is not sui generis. The second option is that while the variables operating in religion are not unique, they may be more salient in religious context, and thus their effect is greater within rather than outside religion. However, they remain purely psychological variables, and what is becoming a common phrase associated with the work of Anne Taves, things deemed to be religious have increased salience, but not for only any sui generis properties they possess. Didi's second two options allow for the possibility of the inclusion of the transcendent, especially in the study of religious and paranormal experiences. The least controversial of the first in this set of options is that psychological variables uniquely interact in religious contexts, and thus the psychology of religion must acknowledge religion as a cultural phenomenon. The final option is that there are unique variables operating in religion that are ignored by mainstream psychologists. This can include acknowledging the transcendent as an additional causal factor in religious experience. It also suggests a model for the origin of religions as over-beliefs based upon a common experiential core. From this perspective, religiousness, as expressed in purely psychological terms, may confuse things deemed religious by what they exclude in the very process. As Robinson notes, orthodoxies are revealed more vividly by what they exclude than what they affirm. Consider the variety of core precepts adopted by the world's religions and how great the surface conflicts are. But then consider the core protected convictions, absent which the very notion of religion is rendered jejune. The fact that almost anything can be sacred is constrained by the fact that it must reveal something other than itself. This is an ontological constraint on what can be generally deemed religious. In Eliade's succinct phrasing, a thing becomes sacred insofar as it embodies, that is, reveals, something other than itself. Elsewhere, I have argued that despite the deserved reputation of James' varieties of religious experience, it is wise to read it as partly a response to issues he alluded to in his monumental, influential Principles of Psychology. James's efforts in the Principles was to restrict himself to the assumptions of natural science. The Principles is over 1,300 pages, and 2/3 of the text is devoted to conceptual and philosophical concerns about the empirical data presented. Here, data limited to scientific positivism is in dialogue with philosophy. When James' publisher called for an abbreviated text, James produced one. Referred to as Jimmy by its students, it set the tone for current introductory text. A brief introduction, largely followed by the gradual building up of psychology, starting with sensory process, and always seeking correlates between brain and mental states. It was but 1/3 the pages of the Principles, and lest James frustrated by what he called its metaphysical leaps. The number of pages devoted to philosophical issues in the Principle exceeded the number of pages in the abbreviated Jimmy. Then as now, scientific positivism restricts dialogue and stops conversation. Bereft of any serious philosophical discussions, psychology texts simply declare themselves to be presenting the results of something called science. James was not convinced that trying to treat psychology as if it were a natural science would prove to be productive. He reminded readers of the Jimmy never to forget that the natural science assumptions which we started are provisional and reversible things. When James turned to the study of religion for the Gifford lectures, he paid scant attention to psychology developed in the principles. His focus is succinctly stated in a footnote in the Varieties critical of Freud. The plain truth is that to interpret religion, one must in the end look to the immediate content of religious consciousness. James's empiricism included God, the paranormal, and spiritual realities. He rejected the soon-to-be formulated methodological exclusion of the transcendent and then emerging psychology of religion championed by Theodore Flournoy, and implicit, when not explicit, in current criticisms of what we'll call theistic psychology. Far from denying that religion was sui generis, he claimed just the opposite. As Hewitt has recently argued, his sui generis approach to religious experience insisted that all organized belief systems arise out of efforts to articulate, regulate, and control universal emotional and psychological phenomena. Theistic psychology, especially when focused upon religious experience, accepts the claim that one can experience God or a transcendent reality. One explanation for this is simply that they in fact do. Both Papura and myself argue for a methodological agnosticism that allows the content of religious belief to enter into psychological explanation. Robinson refers to transcendental phenomenologies, or the thoughts and sentiments arising from experiences and the value of folk psychology founded upon essentially religious or spiritual beliefs. Religion is not reified as an object, is intimately linked to religiousness. Seen as a cumulative faith tradition, such religions can become characters of a lived faith by those who study them under the principles of the methodological exclusion of the transcendent. Methodological agnosticism is open to the claims to have experienced transcendent realities and keeps in play that they might be genuine empirical options for any new paradigm for the study of religion, as with theistic, paranormal, and spiritual psychologies. The postulate that defines the study about religion is an explanation stopper for those whose epistemic rationality affirms what their experience is of. Theistic psychologists are right to criticize their critics for essentially post-Kantian view that we have no access to reality, much less God, than mediated through biology, language, or culture. The issue of social constructionism is an epistemological barrier to ontological claims when reflexively applied to psychological claims and is self-refuting, as it refuses to give epistemological criteria by which an ontological claim can be legitimately ignored. Our mind can engage beyond religionists to the ontological claims of religion and parapsychology. As Shibrik says, it is like barbecue tongs, flawed tools to grasp real, mind-independent things. In the highly influential co-authored defense of a sociology of knowledge that tried to exclude the transcendent, Berger and Luckman recognized that if the principle were effectively applied, it would be like trying to push a bus from the inside. Here it is sufficient to note that social constructionism is a presumptive claim, that as a methodological postulate for psychology of religion is an unwarranted banishment of the transcendent from the empirical study of not only religious but paranormal experiences. Thus, one of the strongest challenges to theistic psychology are simply begging the demarcation question of what constitutes science. What qualifies as psychology is as problematic as what constitutes religion. You cannot problemize one and ignore the other. As Smith notes, since it's emerged, and especially in the last 2 centuries, the borders of science have been no more stable than those of Poland's. As some religious claims, as with science, are unintelligible apart from their ontological claims, behaviorism remains a perfect exemplar. Behaviorism remains a valid, if limited, methodological epistemology. It must not be confused with the ontological claim that there are not minds to be studied by their methods. With respect to religion, methodological naturalism is often conflated into a metaphysical naturalism. There is an increased use of probability theory, both hypothesis testing and Bayesian, to attempt the unwarranted leap from epistemological methods to metaphysical conclusions. A useful example here is the common rejection of paranormal claims by supporters of psychological science, matching the rejection of a belief in God by eminent science. Only by assuming metaphysical naturalism, or either the existence of God or paranormal phenomena perceived as extraordinary, so that extreme epistemological evidence is required for their support. Critics of theistic psychology are quick to claim psychological science makes no ontological claims about the objective reality of the content or possible object of religious belief. This posturing towards persons of faith is seldom extended to sciences that challenge the metaphysical naturalism of psychological science, still mired in the positivism rejected by William James after his Principles of Psychology. Many proponents of psychological science are quick to suggest that parapsychological claims are false. When not simply dismissed as outright fraud or a hoax, the common assurance is that experimental evidence for parapsychological phenomena cannot be verified by those properly trained in the experimental techniques of psychological science. It is worth noting here that William James is the only psychologist to have been twice president of the APA, 1903 and 1930, and even more, a founding president of the American Society for Psychological Research 3 years after the founding of the Society for Psychological Research in Great Britain. Further, he retained a lifelong interest in psychological research, psychic research, and religious research. And unlike other American psychologists, he believed in finding ways to empirically study these phenomena, including his own lifelong interest in spiritualism. Prior to COVID-19, if you Google crisis, you would likely come up and uncover the replication crisis in psychology. This crisis directly applies to the claims left silent in the debate over the scientific status of psychology, whether it is or ought to be a science. Here the issue is largely epistemological. For the advocates of psychological science, it is both epistemological and ontological for advocates of theistic psychology, in which transcendent realities are acknowledged. The acceptance of these realities embedded in indigenous cultures, acknowledged worldwide, are what Robinson argues are experiences ripe to be acknowledged for those who invent what he calls a truly psychological psychology worth having. Paranormal claims are widely rejected by cognitive scientists. They are used as exemplars in introductory textbooks of superstition or magical thinking. Magicians are now more likely to be called illusionists in the West. This despite the fact that for indigenous cultures worldwide, and some, even in the West, culture is inseparable from theistic and spiritual worldviews in which magic and the paranormal are widely acknowledged. The irony is that illusionists performing magic tricks may be simply finding natural means to create illusions by what in other cultural contexts are simply spiritual realities. The failure to replicate normal paranormal studies is widely cited despite Utt's claim that parapsychology is one of the few cases where point null hypothesis makes sense to disprove fallacious claims. However, issues that have become commonly identified as the replication crisis suggest psychological science is not as unproblematic as its opponents suggest. Here briefly, I will discuss 5 examples. First, claims have been made that as many as 60% of the psychological experiments fail to be replicated. In addition, when experiments are replicated, they often replicate with a much lower magnitude of effect. The file drawer problem that have been used to criticize parapsychological research remain rampant in mainstream psychological science and suggest failures to replicate may be even higher than the 60% often quoted, despite well-known solutions. Obvious failure to replicate is a complex issue. Liggins and Christopher see this, as I do, as a boon for theoretical and philosophical psychology. Second, psychologists committed to psychological science have often used failure to replicate as the grounds for dismissing paranormal claims. However, this has come full circle, as in a special issue reviewing meta-analysis in parapsychology for the journal Statistical Science with commentary, they have noted that high rates of replication in parapsychology are as high as in any other field. In some areas, authorities who disagree have agreed to cooperate and to explore their different philosophies with respect to the empirical data. An example is the widely acknowledged work of Hyman on the Gainesfield controversy, and he concludes that this is an area where real effects above chance are consistently and repeated. Third, methodological rigor is seldom the reason for failure to replicate. For instance, Darrell Benn's widely reported study of precognition has recently been challenged by 3 unsuccessful attempts to replicate. Here the issue, though, is not failure to replicate, than the fact that there were calls for the editor to redact Benn's article, even though he is widely known for his expertise in experimental methodology. Fourth, quality of research methods seldom overrides biases of researchers. For instance, despite widespread disbelief by psychologists in paranormal phenomena, research in parapsychology is rigorous. Independent reviews of over 5,000 studies in scientific journals from 1996 to 1998 revealed that parapsychology had 85% blind studies, compared to only 7% in psychology. Replication of the survey using a different set of journals reported that parapsychology had 79% blind studies, compared to only 22% in psychology. The widespread disregard of methodologically sound parapsychological research by psychological science is problematic on several levels. Here we simply note that the null hypothesis is always false. The bias against the null hypothesis has been noted but largely ignored in hypothesis testing. It almost never includes parapsychological options, which radically alter how one evaluates and designs research. Seldom do mainstream theories test against several alternative paranormal hypotheses or consider paranormal compounds in experimental research. Finally, in established journals in the field of health, educators have challenged the research published in their own journals. For instance, a former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine notes that after over 2 decades, she takes no pleasure in the conclusion that it's no longer possible to believe the clinical research published in this prestigious journal. A chief editor of The Lancet reports that science has taken a dark turn, and that likely as much of half the published scientific literature may be simply untrue. So, advocates for theistic psychology are correct in placing psychological science on the defensive as an exemplar of sound science, for a field Robinson claims is a poor contender for the title. While critics of theistic psychology want to defend the naturalism of the principles, advocates for theistic psychology support, at least in principle, the psychology of the varieties of religious experience. In closing remarks prophetic of the transition to the focus on individual cases in the varieties, James anticipated the danger of an exclusive reliance upon measurement and the statistical treatment of aggregated data under an umbrella that shields us from acknowledging other ontological possibilities than naturalism. And this is a quote from James's footnote. Lost is the ontological stuff of the world. The sentimental facts and relations are butchered at a blow, but the rationality yielded is so superbly complete in form that to many minds that atones for the loss and reconciles the thinker to the notion of a purposeless universe in which all things and qualities, men, love, dulcima, mundi numina, are but illusions of our fantasy attached to accidental clouds of dust, which will be dissipated by the eternal cosmic weather as they were formed. Today, James's varieties are more likely to be read in religious studies programs than by students in psychology. James's varieties is for many simply philosophy. The almost total commitment to methodological naturalism among psychologists is associated with a single master narrative. Evolutionary psychology is one example of what Plantinga calls a grand explanatory myth. Many forms of evolutionary psychology can provide a Bayesian approach to at least a probable estimate as to the improbability of a world in which creation, intentionality, and gods were once common. Here God is found to be improbable as are paranormal phenomena. Critics of evolutionary psychological explanation for religion have properly called out our psychologists for what amounts to a folk Darwinism. As Head and Johnson have said, given the evidence at hand evoking the theory of natural selection to explain the prevalence of beliefs is about as scientific valid as invoking the theory of gravitation to explain the attraction between two people. Religious and paranormal experiences provide evidential force. For James, the force is absolute for those who have the experience, but the evidence can never be complete. While the epistemic authority of an experience may be absolute for the experiencer, it is provisional and a source of possibilities for researchers. What these possibilities are is the task for theistic psychology to specify and defend. The challenge for theistic psychology is to create a science of religions that successfully expands and discovers more of the reality than currently included in naturalistic paradigms of psychological science. One can test multiple null hypotheses and welcome ontological claims beyond the material and the mundane. James never established his science of religion, but all the pieces are in place. My own position is clear. It is the one in which I end this brief talk. It is the same as the answer gave, likely apocryphal, when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said simply, I think it would be a great idea. Thank you.